Okay, I am back. I'm just going to read you the conclusion, which is the last 7 pages of Ireland's desire for home rule and how it came about that all of this was brewing under King George V's reign. And all of it. He was, as I said, he had his own set of issues to contend with. Ireland and India were on their independent movements for self-government. And he was still the British, it was still the British Empire. And so much went on during his reign. He ended up changing, after the war, the name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. The Russian monarchy was deteriorating. They ended up getting assassinated. They were an absolute monarchy. Whereas here, George had a constitutional monarchy, but he had fractiousness occurring in both Ireland and India at the same time. So I want to finish reading up these chapters to see all the issues he had when it came to Ireland and some of the influences that he had in Parliament and in his prime ministers and his ministers with what they thought they should do about Ireland having their own home rule. And here he is just trying to keep a neutral political stance on everything. And I thought he did very well. But I will pick up where I left off. The prime minister did not reciprocate his sovereign's confidence. To his face, Asquith expressed gratitude for the king's tactful mediation. Behind his back, he was less than respectful. At the end of the cabinet meeting, when Harcourt mentioned that he was going to have a tooth extracted, the prime minister said he was in a similar plight. He was going to see the king. He told Venetia Stanley that he had received a letter of a rather neurotic kind from the highest quarters. And he later wrote, I found the main preoccupation of the other party to my interview at the palace was with his own position and the terrible crossfire to which he conceived himself to be exposed. The wry humor with which Asquith referred to his sovereign was unkind, but not undeserved. In his considered utterance, the king could match the statesmanship of any minister. In the drawing room, however, his artless comments of men and manners worried even Queen Mary. He was sometimes too outspoken, she admitted in the last year of her life. I remember that I once had a lady-in-waiting who was a fool and used to ask indiscreet questions of my husband in the motor car. He always answered exactly what he thought. I had to get rid of the woman. Curzon, a member of the royal house party at Chatsworth in the winter of 1913, had told Bonar-Law, the king was less temperate in language and more excited in manner than at Balmoral. He is, of course, greatly keen on a settlement. Forgetting, I think, that the Lady Crewe was the wife of an eminent cabinet minister, he poured into her astonished car terrific denunciations of Lloyd George's on the subject of pheasants and mangold wurzels. I would have been asking too much of the Squire of Sandringham to remain silent. A few weeks earlier, Lloyd George had renounced his attacks on landowners by alleging that their pheasants devoured whole fields of mangold wurzels, an absurd complaint, as any countryman could have told him. The king's indignation at Lloyd George's howler seemed less tactless than Curzon's choice of Bonar Law as his confidant. Perhaps Curzon had not yet heard how his Glaswegian colleague, staying at one of the great houses of England, was startled during his morning walk by a cock pheasant, which rose suddenly from under his feet. The recently elected leader of the country gentlemen's party inquired of his host, "Pray, what bird might that be?" Lloyd George was not the only target of the king's displeasure during the shooting party at Chatsworth. Among the other guests of the Duke and the Duchess of Devonshire were the Abercorns and the Crews, two families that had long been close friends. Inflamed, however, by the specter of civil war in Ireland, the Duchess of Abercorn refused to dine next to even so mild a member of the government as Lord Crewe, and the table had to be swiftly rearranged. The king was annoyed by that insult to a minister in his own presence. At the end of the visit, he invited the Crews, but not the Abercorns, to travel back to London with him on the royal train. The king and his cousin Mensdorff shook their heads over the growing intrusion of political bitterness into social life. Nowadays, one can hardly invite government and opposition. The ambassador wrote in his diary, "Women are more passionate than men. As usual, they do their best to make matters worse." The Londonderries, as fervently unionist as their fellow Irish landowners, the Abercorns, refused an invitation to Windsor for Ascot races. They would not be seen in the same carriage with liberals such as the Chesterfields or the Granards. And at the evening party given by the Duchess of Sutherland, Lord Londonderry turned on his heel and left the house just as he was about to be received by his hostess. He had noticed Lord and Lady Lincolnshire in the crowd. To a monarch who valued an established social order, such tantrums were disagreeable, but overshadowed by the darker prospect of civil war. Undaunted by the failure of the private talks between Asquith and Bonar Law, the king maintained a relentless pressure on both. "I shall certainly ask the Prime Minister to come here to see me for one night," he wrote from Sandringham in the year 1914. "I shall keep on bothering him as much as possible." Inadequate concessions, the king insisted, were worse than none. At his prompting, the cabinet abandoned its proposal for what was known as veiled exclusion of the Protestant counties from Home Rule. "I've always given you as my opinion," the king told Asquith, "that Ulster will never agree to send representatives to an Irish Parliament in Dublin, no matter what safeguards or guarantees you may provide." He again demurred when Cabinet produced a new plan, completely excluding Ulster from the provisions of Home Rule. But for a period of only 3 years, so short a reprieve, he warned, would not be acceptable to Sir Edward Carson, a leader of the militant Ulster Unionists. By sheer persistence, the king had his way. In March 1914, the Prime Minister made a concession that at any time during the previous 2 years would have been thought inconceivable. Introducing the Home Rule Bill for the third and the last of the required parliamentary circuits, Asquith proposed that Ulster should be excluded not for 3 years but for 6, and by the time that period had elapsed, 2 British general elections would have tested the nation's opinion of Home Rule. Even before the Prime Minister had spoken, the Kings privately begged both Bonar Law and Carson to examine the government's forthcoming declaration with a generous eye. He asked in vain. Carson demanded Ulster's absolute and indefinite exclusion from Home Rule. He told the Commons, "We do not want sentence of death with a stay of execution for 6 years." Redmond had reluctantly agreed to the delay of 6 years only. Under severe pressure from his Liberal allies, he could no further without betraying his fellow Irish nationalists. The deadlock was once more complete. Okay. Relations between the two parties were further inflamed by Winston Churchill, who in a public speech at Bradford revealed a seemingly determination to impose Home Rule on Ulster by force. He accused Carson of a treasonable conspiracy, and he proclaimed that there were worse things than bloodshed, even on an extended scale. He invited his audience to join him in putting these grave matters to proof. The king was both alarmed and bitter at the approach of civil war and begged Asquith to submit the Home Rule issue to a national referendum. His present government, he said, would in due course disappear and be forgotten, but he himself would remain, and his action would be remembered. Yet even as the king pleaded with the Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace on the 19th of March, what he most dreaded had apparently come to pass. A mutinous refusal by officers of the British Army to take part in operations against Ulster. He wrote in anguish 2 days later, "I am grieved beyond words at this disastrous and irreparable catastrophe which has befallen my army, which whatever may now happen will tarnish its long and glorious history." Throughout the Home Rule controversy, the king had repeatedly warned Asquith against the use of the army to coerce Ulster, and the Prime Minister had frequently brushed aside his sovereign's apprehension. The government, he reassured the king, had no intention of employing troops for political purposes. "Who are they going to fight?" he inquired blandly. In any case, Asquith added, the king was no more head of an army than he was head of every other public department. Any order given to the troops would be on the responsibility of ministers, not the monarch. That lecture on the constitutional practice failed to impress the king. He saw himself, if not quite Henry V, at least entitled to a more positive role in the military matters than in the affairs of the treasury or the post office. His belief was shared by the armed forces themselves, who claimed a personal allegiance to their sovereign, unknown among Whitehall clerks or postmen. It was therefore with a sense of both national and personal humiliation that on the morning of 21 March the king read reports of unrest among his troops at Curragh near Dublin. That he first learned of it from the newspapers without a warning or a word from the government, adding to his astonishment and his anger. The truth is, it emerged and was less calamitous, a tale not so much of a ministerial deceit and military disaffection as the hysteria and muddle of ambiguous orders, and poor leadership. A few days earlier, the cabinet committee that watched over Irish affairs had summoned Sir Arthur Paget, the general officer commanding troops in Ireland, to a conference in London. There he received certain orders, but since they were given to him orally, it is not known precisely what they were. The ministerial committee, which included such experienced rhetoricians as John Seeley, the Secretary for War, and Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, later insisted that it had done no more than instruct Paget to safeguard the military installations of Northern Ireland against expected attacks from Carson's Ulster volunteers. For such purposes, he would have at his disposal substantial military and naval reinforcements. When Paget expressed anxiety about the possible conduct of his officers, most of who had sympathized with Ulster, the Secretary of War laid down two guiding principles. Officers were required to suppress disorder in support of the civil power, should not be permitted to resign their commissions, but must, if they refuse to obey orders, be dismissed from the army. Officers domiciled in Ulster, however, could be excused of their duties. It may be noted in passing that the consciences of the non-commissioned officers and other ranks serving in Ireland received no such consideration. Having returned to Ireland, Paget summoned the senior officers of his command. The orders which he gave them, when not coherent, were very different from those he had received in London. With a theatrical self-importance that on any less momentous occasion would have been merely comic, he predicted that active operations were about to commence against Ulster, that Ireland would shortly be ablaze, that officers must decide whether their duty lay within a matter of hours. At no time did the excitable General Paget say that the impending troop movements were precautionary, or that the subsequent operations would be confined to the maintenance of law and order in support of the civil power. When he asked, somewhat naively, whether his orders came from the king, he replied that they did. "Don't think, officers," he added on the following day, "that I take orders from those swines of politicians. No, I only take orders from the sovereign." Paget's muddled grasp of his War Office instructions and inflammatory language had an immediate and deplorable effect on the officers under his command. Led by the hot-headed but popular Brigadier General Hubert Gough, 58 cavalry officers prepared to sacrifice their careers, although it is often forgotten that 280 officers from the less glamorous regiment declined to do so. They would fight the king's enemies, but not the king's loyal subjects of Ulster. At no time, however, did any of the 58 refuse to obey orders. Paget had offered them an alternative course of instant dismissal, and they took it. Without that abrupt ultimatum, which the historian of the episode rightly calls unnecessary, injustices, and improper, every officer would have done his duty, and the so-called Curragh mutiny would never have taken place. Asquith shared the king's dismay at the news from Ireland and acted with resolution. He was soon able to assure the king that Paget's provocative orders lacked the authority of the government and that of the recalcitrant officers would at once resume their duties. In view of the cabinet, he wrote, It is wrong to demand from the officers any assurance as to what their conduct might be in a contingency which might never arise. The king forbore to reply that the prime minister had shown no such scruple in November 1910, when extracting an assurance from his sovereign in equally opaque circumstances. In spite of government protestations that the troop movements had been purely defensive, the belief persisted that General Paget was the instrument of a larger but unauthorized design by Sealy and Churchill to overwhelm Ulster's resistance to Home Rule. Only with the surmise of such a plan to do certain events became intelligible. Sealy's failure to give Paget written orders, the general's whirling words to his officers, the appointment of a military governor of Belfast, Churchill's secret dispatch of 8 battleships and an attendant vessels to nearby waters. Whether it was Machiavellian or merely inept, Sealy was fortunate to escape dismissal from office. But the arch-colonel, as Asquith called him, did not long survive the consequences of his folly. The cause of his downfall was Go's attempt to blackmail an already embarrassed government. Go refused to return to Ireland without a written declaration that the army would never be used to crush political opposition to Home Rule. Fearing a further display of military disaffection, the Secretary for War weakly agreed to Go's terms, but was disowned by the cabinet. If it was wrong for General Paget to demand on behalf of the government an assurance of future conduct from his officers, it was equally wrong for General Go to demand a similar assurance from the government. Asquith, a newfound man of steel, called for Sealy's resignation and assumed the duties of Secretary of War in addition to his own. The crisis was at an end. Lacking the resilience of his ministers, the king remained deeply distressed by the curragh imbroglio. However cosmetic the military role to which constitutional purists might limit him, he felt the near disgrace of his army as a personal mortification. He was vexed, too, that his political neutrality should be questioned. His name dragged into the arena of party strife. As Stamfordham wrote, "The chief complaint of the army is against the king. They say he ought to have asserted himself and prevented all this trouble." On the other hand, the radicals are denouncing Buckingham Palace and its evil influences. The disparaging use of the euphemism Buckingham Palace was an additional irritant. "What do they mean by saying that Buckingham Palace is not me?" the king would explain. "Who else is there? I should like to know, do you mean the footmen?" Even members of the royal household tactically tried to enlist him on one side or the other of the Home Rule controversy. Queen Alexandra's Comptroller General Sir Dighton Probyn, who had won the Victoria Cross in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, once more scented the smoke of battle and assured the king, "We don't care a rap for the government, but we are all ready and we will be shooting as soon as your majesty tells us to." The king replied with restraint, "Oh, I see you mean to drag me in and make me responsible." There was only one ultimate relief from malicious enemies and embarrassing friends: the settlement of the Ulster problem by compromise. "You appreciate, I know," the king told Asquith in April, The terrible position in which I've been placed in, that a solution is not found. Asquith, writing to Venetia Stanley, dismissed his sovereign's plea as a rather hysterical letter from G.R. But even the imperturbable Prime Minister realized that time was running out. Only weeks remained before the Home Rule Bill would pass the Commons for the third time. Immune from amendment or rejection by the Lords, both the Protestants in the North and the Roman Catholics in the South were meanwhile smuggling in rifles by tens of thousands of cartridges by the millions. It was, however, until July, after another round of private talks between government and opposition that had failed, that the Prime Minister agreed to repeated suggestions from the King that Asquith and Bonar-Law, Redmond and Carson, each accompanied by a single supporter, should attend a round-table conference under the chairmanship of the Speaker, in which the monarch modestly called "My House." The conclave, which began on the 21st of July, assembled one of the more chaste apartments of Buckingham Palace. The 1,844 rooms, so called after the year in which the Russian Emperor Nicholas I had lodged there. The room was called 1844 room. The Queen Victoria's insight into his character may serve as an epitaph on the Home Rule Conference of 1914. Politics and military concerns are the only thing he takes great interest in. The arts and all other softer occupations he is insensible to. But he is sincere, and I'm certain sincere even in his most despotic acts. In the course of the preceding negotiations, the government had come to accept the principle of Ulster's exclusion from Home Rule. What remained to be decided were the boundaries of the excluded territory. That, in practice, meant the future of Tyrone. On the eve of Buckingham Palace Conference, Stamfordham had written to its chairman, Mr. Speaker Lowther, "It's obvious that civil war cannot be permitted on the subject of the delimitation of a county. The King is sure you will not allow the conference to break off without finding a solution." Within 3 days, both sovereign and private secretary were undeceived. Again, it was Miss Stanley who first heard the news from the Prime Minister. "We sat again this morning for an hour and a half, discussing maps and figures, and always getting back to the most damnable creation of the perverted ingenuity of the man, the County Tyrone. The extraordinary feature of the discussion was in complete agreement, in principle, of Redmond and Carson. Each said, 'I must have the whole of Tyrone, or die.' But I quite understand why you say the same." The Speaker, who incarnates bluff and unimaginative English sense, of course, cut in. "When each of two people say they must have the whole, why not cut it in half?" They would neither of them look at such a suggestion. Yeah. That in effect marked the collapse of the conference at end. Asquith noted, "The King came in, rather emotional, and said in 2 sentences, 'Thank God, there was not another speech.' He said, 'Farewell, I am sorry, and I thank you.' He then very wisely had the different members brought in to him privately and saw each turn, Redmond was a good deal impressed by his interview, especially as the king told him that he was convinced of the necessity of home rule. The king's initiative seems in retrospect to have been ill-advised, as it offered little hope of success, yet involved a constitutional sovereign in the most contentious of all political issues. Even before its failure, Charles Trevelyan, MP, epitomized the hostility of his fellow radicals. If Asquith didn't supervise it, it is grossly unconstitutional and partisan. If he did, he is responsible for allowing the king to justify the conduct of the disloyalists. The only advantage is it will lead to outspoken protests by the labor and radical sections and a turning of the politics of working men toward republicanism. And when the conference proved fruitless, Trevelyan exulted, "So much for the king's interference. Larn him to be towed." The victim of such spite had every reason to be aggrieved. "Thanks for your kind letter and sympathy," the king replied to a friend's condolence. "I want sympathy in these days, and I can't help but thinking I am being badly treated." The ordeal of the sovereign and his subjects had in fact hardly begun. 2 days after the end of the conference, the king took the almost unprecedented step of canceling a sporting engagement. He wrote to the Duke of Richmond, "I very much regret to say that I find it quite impossible for me to leave London tomorrow to pay you my promised visit at Goodwood, which I had been so much looking forward to. The political crisis is so acute with regard to the Irish question, and now the probability of a general European war necessitates my remaining in London for the present. I hope you will have fine weather and that the racing will be good." Scarcely more than a week later, Great Britain was at war with Germany, and the conflict over Irish Home Rule was postponed indefinitely. So there you have it. That is the dilemma. That's why they couldn't. It was so complicated to try to resolve how to divide up Ireland with the different influences and ideologies about Ireland, and just 250 years before this issue came up, we have to remember that they placed a lot of English people into the town of Ulster. There's a lot of Protestants there, along with Irish Catholics. Some Irish peers were displaced from their homes, and they put in a lot of English people. And then they took their castles, and it's very complicated. Ulster, the whole Ulster area, Northern Ireland, it has a different demographic, both of Irish and English, and also Irish Catholics and Protestants. So it was a very difficult thing for them to settle. And then, of course, came the World War I, and it got delayed further. So anyway, that's the end of that. And we will pick up in the next section of Constitutional Monarchy, where they're entering the World War I and they have to boost up their naval armaments. And that's in a separate episode.